No, they were using new like
Welcome everybody. So today we have Dr. Kelly Dunning from the University of Wyoming. She's the Timberline Associate Professor of Outdoor Recreation and Tourism at the University of Wyoming, and her lab of Wildlife and Wilderness Recreation, working on systems, places, and species that attract tourism from all over the world. And now where the conservation is becoming more and more challenging due to the global environmental change. Today, she's going to talk to us about how we can use climate models to possibly inform climate adaptation strategies and also the marine sanctuary management. Without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Kelly Dunning.
Great. Thank you guys for having me today. I really appreciate you hosting me. I don't know what I'm called. I'm kind of like an affiliated researcher with NCAR, so it's good to be here. It's good to be back. The title of my talk today is Adapting to Change in National Marine Sanctuaries, and I want to say thank you to co-authors, many of whom are in the room. The first author is our first graduate student with our collaborative work, Dan Morris, who now actually works for the Forest Service on a Presidential Management Fellowship. He was funded by the NCAR Early Career Innovators Award, and then went on to get this Presidential Management Fellowship and is now just doing a great job in the federal system working on outdoor rec. So that NCAR, those NCAR grants that you send to various universities really impact people's lives. Dan is just so grateful for the opportunity and doing great now. And then folks in the room, Fred DePac, who's moved on to another organization, Kristen, our current PhD student who's based at Auburn University, Gretchen Luchauer, Melissa, and then that's me last. If you want to send me an email, it's just my name, kelly.dunning@uwyo.edu, and happy to talk with any of you about future collaborations or anything like that. My lab, the Wildlife and Wilderness Recreation Lab, we're kind of from the public policy world, so we write books. Y'all have awesome papers, so many papers, but for us, it's like we kind of mark our career in books. So these are 2 books. They're pretty much available in every library for free as an ebook. Our most recent one, which I'm pretty proud of, also partially funded by NCAR, Democratic Management of an Ecosystem Under Threat. These are all the ways that we can get people more involved in decision-making around reefs and reefs conservation, whether that's using science or just like democratic pathways to protecting reefs and making sure that we're doing the best thing for reefs. And then the book on the left, that's my doctoral research, big presence in Southeast Asia, but now we're kind of shifting more to look at like Caribbean, Florida, stuff like that. I just want to talk a tiny bit about my lab in case it triggers any ideas to work together. I've just found partnering with NCAR to be a really wonderful experience, and I'll talk a little bit more at the end about some hopeful future work that we're doing. But the Wildlife Wilderness Recreation Lab, we're working right now really closely with Wyoming Game and Fish on a couple topics: how to get people to participate more, how to reconcile the fact that we have a sovereign nation within Wyoming at the Shoshone-Arapaho Fish and Wildlife. So how can we get more people stopping in Shoshone-Arapaho territory on the Wind River Reservation? How can we get Wyomingites to participate more in game and fish regulations? You know, I think a lot of people are having this problem, whether you work in fish and wildlife or any other sphere. People aren't showing up or coming out after COVID. The world opened back up, but it's hard to get people to come back out. So one of the big projects we're working on right now with Wyoming Game and Fish is getting people to show up to public meetings. Wyoming's been in the news recently, a predator incident with the wolf. We actually had to delay some of our work because of the guy that captured and tortured a wolf and killed the wolf. So we have this big survey set to go out asking the Wyoming public and the Wind River public, how can we get you to come out to meetings more and participate more? So we have to delay it by a month because of this guy. So just a little interesting aside. You know, we didn't want it to be all like hate mail to us and to the agency. We also work on public lands and tourism. If you've ever been to the Medicine Bow National Forest, my students in their capstone class, they do all the snowmobile counts. and they do like license plate, county of origin, and this all goes into the winter use travel plan. I'm from South Florida, so this was really my first winter, so being the person that does snowmobile data stuff is still kind of surprising to me, and I'm like, is this real? But, you know, recreation, much like we can't get folks to show up for public meetings and stuff like that, recreation's the opposite. Everybody is recreating. Use of the Medicine Bow National Forest has increased so much that it's almost hard to keep track of. So this data is one little small part of helping federal folks kind of keep track of the drastic increase in visitors. Just a little bit more about my lab. We also work in sub-Saharan Africa. We work in Southeast Asia. Most of my students go into public service in agencies or in NGOs. We have sort of like an equity focus to a lot of the stuff we do, and just always focusing on bringing in voices of marginalized folks and just bringing in people who maybe have a hard time having their voice heard. And then, you know, if you're interested in this sort of thing, we do like a new to hunting and new to fishing programs out of the University of Wyoming. But if you're ever looking to get into mentored hunting or fishing, just send me an email and you can join our lab, because we do something like that every year. We offer it to the whole university, but there's no reason that NCAR folks can't come as well. And the reason that we do that is because licensed sales fund conservation in the states, right? So there's an excise tax on everything that you use for hunting and fishing, 11%. And your license is matched by the federal government, and we like to get new hunters and fishers in the pool in Colorado and Wyoming because those funds go to pay for conservation. Last thing I'll say about the lab, we're really focused on service-oriented leadership, and Dan on the right, funded through an NCAR grant. Greg had a portion of his salary funded by the NCAR grant, and wrote some really good literature review stuff on resilience and adaptation that we ended up using in our NOAA grant that we're all working on now. So again, thanks to NCAR for funding these students. And Greg now works at the White House. He does all the budgeting for the National Park Service. And Dan, like I said, is at the Forest Service. He's in the White River National Forest here in Colorado, the most visited recreation site in the United States. So NCAR shapes these students, and they go on to do great things because of you, so thank you. I want to talk a little bit about the project and the research that I'm going to talk about today, like the origin of how it came to be. It started with this early career innovator award through NCAR. We, thanks to Melissa, Kristen, Fred, and Deepak, we went for this Climate Programs Office grant, and we were successful in it. And then a little bit of extra money from the National Academies of Science Gulf Research Program went into it as well. The big research question that we're asking in this, we call it like the NOAA project or the Sanctuary Project. The big research question that we're asking here is, how are people adapting to environmental change in the federal sanctuary system? You know, everybody knows national parks. Not everybody knows that we have a beautiful network of federally managed national marine sanctuaries. They're some of the most iconic and important marine sanctuaries on Earth. And thank goodness we have this system, because they're protecting these like crown jewels of our coastal system the same way that like Yellowstone protects our national park or our landscapes. Something that has been really cool about our project is we've had people from the sanctuary side at NOAA get really involved with shaping the work up front, even giving serious input to the grant writing phase itself. John Armour, for example, gave us a little feedback on our proposal, and then came out to Auburn to meet our students and hear about the project about a year ago. So what we do in my lab is often our questions are shaped by decision makers themselves. What are the questions that you have? What is the format that we can give you our findings and data in, where you can actually use it to manage marine sanctuaries? So that's kind of some of the opportunities that we've been given through this work. And usually on past grants like this or projects like this, when we have like the science people and the social science people, it's very split. But I kind of like to brag that there is no split anymore, because our science folks from NOAA are doing the engagement work in the sanctuaries. They're meeting with policymakers, they're meeting with decision makers, they're holding our workshops. So there is no split anymore. But again, that attests to the fact that NCAR is awesome, and y'all are awesome. So. Something that we think about a lot is governance. So the public policy systems that manage ecosystems, especially climate vulnerable ecosystems. It's really wild to think this, but this is like a 500-kilometer coral reef third largest barrier reef in the world. I grew up right here, Boynton Beach, Florida. And my home reef, where I used to go lobstering when I was old, like not even old enough to be in school, I was going for lobster. This is the Southeast Florida Coral Reef Initiative. This is like the Wild West of coral reefs. You can go out and do anything you want on that reef. You can pull anything off any time of the year. There's very few regulations and rules. You compare that to this part of the reef where probably many of you have gone for like a family trip down to Key Largo or Key West. In the Florida Keys, on the other hand, there's very strict regulations on what you can harvest, what you can do, the types of gear that you can use on the reef, certain periods of harvest. So it's like very strict here in the federal sanctuary, Wild West up near where I grew up. But then you also have overlapping jurisdictions of like the state park here in yellow. You have some National Park Service managed sites. So it's just this really interesting kind of patchwork quilt of decision makers who are in charge of this ecosystem. And as you probably know, y'all get to spend time in Rocky Mountain National Park and Yellowstone National Park out here. It's really hard kind of encountering rapidly increasing and developing problems just in one place. So when you have a very climate vulnerable system and it's like a patchwork quilt of governance arrangements, it becomes extra hard to look after the reef. Why do reefs matter? Many of you know in the room, they buffer one of the largest metropolitan areas in the country from big disasters like hurricanes. They provide, these biodiversity resources that are just so culturally important for people that grow up in Florida, for tourists who come and visit Florida. Everybody's elementary school has a coral reef animal as like the logo for their school. So it's like very culturally like who we are coming from South Florida. But it's also, why we protect this area in a federal sanctuary because, like I said, it's the third largest barrier reef in the world. It's just so special from a habitat standpoint from, for what we have left, which it doesn't seem like a lot because we've lost 95 to 98% of the living coral in the Florida reef tract. But what we do have is still worth seeing and worth visiting and worth bringing your children to. Just as a, if you go out on a snorkel trip or a dive trip, which some of our, did you guys get to do the snorkel? No. Well, so this is actually one of the things that we found, and I'm getting ahead of myself, is like there's more days of the year now that we have these shifting temperatures and shifting dynamics where you actually can't go out. So maybe 10 years ago, if y'all would have gone out, you would have been able to do it. But I'm getting ahead of myself. But these ideas of vulnerability and resilience, this is my brother's apartment up here. So these are things that we live in, having the living reef there, it kind of gives us a little insurance policy against these floods. And what we're seeing now in South Florida is these blue sky flooding events with the king tides are just becoming something that little kids have grown up with. So it's like it'll be sunny out and quite nice out, and you'll have these like, there's a special name that they call them. They're called like, I don't remember. It's like a blue sky flood or something like that. So it's like when I was a kid, we used to worry about hurricanes and big storms, but now it's like these types of life-altering impacts with these coastal systems happen every day. And as you can see, it's like quite nice out on this day. The other thing, coral reef tourism brings $4.4 billion into Florida every year. So it's part of the reason why we don't have a state income tax is because the $4.4 billion that we would otherwise raise in a state income tax comes through tourism revenue. And there's about 50,000 jobs that come as a direct result of the reef, whether they're dive tourism operators, hotel workers, commercial fishermen, recreational fishermen. We have some really storied historical commercial fisheries on the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, most notably of which is the lobster fishery. And we get a lot of our lobstermen come up from Central America and South America. There's a big Cuban population in that fishery. It's just, if any of you, have an interest in history and anthropology, I think the commercial lobster fishery of the Florida Keys would be such a cool book to read. But maybe I can pitch that in a different room. Like I said, the cultural value of reefs, I mean, we grew up, this is like our Christmas meal that we always make. It's like a ceviche made of conch. And it's not the queen conch because that's a listed species, but it's the horse conch, which is like a beautiful, like bright red conch. And you can just, take a little raft out as a 5-year-old kid, grab a conch for Christmas ceviche and, there it is. But it's just like a big part of who we are. You know, our schools used to go on snorkel trips instead of like trips out to the national park, which y'all's children probably go on here. And then even like countries in the Caribbean, like coral reef critters are on their currency. But you know, these are benefits, like these types of tourism, handicrafts and stuff like that. These are kind of harder to quantify than some of the more direct protections for private property, stuff like that. One of the things that we really focus on are participatory methods where, like I said in the beginning, we ask decision makers and managers to have a say in the type of data that we're collecting. Our NCAR colleagues have just really just been so good at this. Like they, from the very beginning, were talking to folks at Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary, at Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. Sanctuary staff are hard to get a hold of. They're very busy. They manage a huge area with very few people, and they need, you know, the science, the law enforcement, like all these different ways to kind of look after the system. But our NCAR folks have made really good inroads with Flower Garden Banks National Marine Sanctuary in Texas and Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary to ask them not just what science they are looking to get to base decisions on, but how they would like to access that. And even NCAR, to the degree that they took a pre-existing system and were like, instead of developing our own thing, we'll just plug in and learn how to put new data, different types of data that you've asked us for into your platform. So that's what I mean by participatory methods. Like the decision makers that actually use the data are having a good degree of input in the type of data that gets collected and how it gets presented to them. And then the work that I do, it's like research, but it's also outreach work. It's engaging decision makers. So same thing on the social side, the economic side. We really want to speak to people like county commissioners, state fish and wildlife personnel, federal fish and wildlife personnel, people who run like the Chamber of Commerce, and just figure out what information on the human side are you lacking to better prepare for these futures that the NCAR models are predicting, and how can we present that to you in a way that is useful to you. These pictures are from some of our Cayman Island work. You know, this is kind of an aside, but people are really putting this like coral regrowing as a possible solution to climate change. And I think you guys understand scale probably better than any room I've ever talked to. And saying that you can fix what's going on with climate on a reef with just regrowing these little corals is almost laughable. Like there are people, but you know, there are people trying to sell this vision in the Caribbean. And I would just say, you know, while it can work in some cases, just, you know, beware of some of these stories that are being told about what we can fix and like the hubris involved, right? Like better that we fix the cause of the problem than come up with these little, like look at that little thing. 1 hectare of reef has 1 million living things on it. I don't know if like these little tiny, anyways, I'm getting ahead of myself. So working with NCAR, getting the NOAA project, having the seed funding from NCAR has allowed us to develop some really innovative methods. And it begins with the NCAR model, the CESM2LE model. I'm such a fraud when I talk about these models because it's really, you know, y'all hold that knowledge, and it's just so valuable having people that are willing to kind of cross into the social science universe. So anything that I say about these models can be much better represented by our colleagues on the project. But then we have Dr. Joni Kleypas' ecosystem model, where she looks at like months of days on the reef where the system was heated so much to cause mortality and just stress on the actual reef. This is like our research design. We start with the NCAR model. We use Dr. Kleypas' degree heating months model. We develop these surveys and questionnaires where we talk to everybody from the director of federal marine sanctuaries all the way down to county commissioners and municipal officials who deal with natural resource management at the very local scale. And then we kind of revise what we think we know about how policy adapts on these climate vulnerable systems. Now, this is the crown jewel of the project. This is Kristen's artwork. One of the best things about like getting out there and having these interviews and these focus groups with real people who are working pretty hard to protect the reef is we laminated a couple of Kristen's illustrations, and we were able to, you know, their first scenarios. So we go from, you know, these highly complex models that you need a college degree to really understand what's going on in these models. We go from those models to these beautiful illustrations, and we hand them to people, and you could see the wheels turning as people begin to give us their responses that wouldn't otherwise have been as rich and detailed, be it not for Kristen's art. So from the NCAR model to the ecosystem model to the actual hypothetical scenarios we're giving people, usually at the global scale, when you hear about like the IPCC, they're much more zoomed out models. And what you always hear from people, especially who work in the city or work for the state, is we need something more finely scaled and customized to us. As y'all know, those are very expensive to produce, very time consuming to produce. So this is as close as we got in our project to that, and we found that the people who we talked to found this to be really useful and really helpful, even just to start thinking about what's going to happen in the future, what tools they have at their disposal to adapt. We've had many people come back to us and say, can we get your data, your outputs, so that we can use it for like a municipal grant or for a small business association grant, to just kind of bring in federal or state grants about kind of like buttressing things for the future and adapting to change in the future. So I'll just quickly, I know it's horrible to read slides, but just so you can kind of see how we move from the NCAR model to what we actually sit down with like a city planner and talk about. By the year 2032, there's going to be persistent levels of bleaching at least once a year. Corals will be broken or diseased. They will be noticeably less colorful. Key species that use the reef as a home, like the lobster, snapper, or grouper, will be noticeably less present. Even with this scenario, however, it's possible that some coral will be more heat tolerant, and those will be the ones that you start seeing more frequently. So we gave one 10 years out, and we gave one 20 years out. And you can see the difference in the image. When you talk to someone for too long, when you're a social scientist, you see their eyes start to glaze over and you're like, okay, I need to end this, I'm boring them to death. But because we had the artwork, they were able to really kind of attach a concrete future predicted thing into their day-to-day life and give us kind of their view on what options they had to adapt and where they needed support and capacity building, whether that be from a federal grant program from FEMA, more support on like the natural resources management side, say from NOAA, or the state folks. State folks don't really look after a lot of coral reefs. Like they're more so in charge of like the mangrove and the like the intertidal zone and the seagrass meadows, but those have a lot of similarities to the reef, and what they do has a big impact on the feds who do manage the reef. So getting their view on how things like water quality, the Everglades restoration, all these things were kind of coming together to build up this condition that we have on the reefs, but also getting them to think about like how they can manage for the future was just such an interesting time in the field. In the social sciences, we use these, they're called theoretical frameworks. Mine is on governance, adaptive governance. This is what you want, right? Like you want governance that kind of pays mind to things that are coming down the pipeline and maybe adjusts and accounts for them and prepares us for them, right? So, an example of a great type of adaptive governance that happens on the marine sanctuaries are these sanctuary advisory councils. You have everybody from like an 18-year-old fishing guide who's just out of high school to the director of the Federal Marine Sanctuary who has a PhD. You just have so many different types of people that sit on these advisory councils. And it's a very interesting moment to be working with and looking at sanctuary advisory councils because they're rewriting the management plan for the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. And in this process, when we went out 2 summers ago, our project and the other projects funded through this Climate Programs Office grant are being used for some of the decisions that are being made on the actual sanctuary blueprint management revision process. But the things that we were kind of looking for were, are stakeholders having dialogue? Are they talking to each other? The answer to this is all the time. It happens at Publix. The Florida Keys is a very small place, right? Like you see people at the grocery store, you see people at your kids' sports thing. You just see people everywhere. Everybody's talking all the time. The Sanctuary Advisory Council has formal and informal sessions where they're coming together and talking about rewriting the management plan and just like the coming change that is abundantly clear with like these climate impacts. Are all relevant institutions included? Yes, to a certain point. We had some interviews that suggested people are included too much to the extent that it may take 3 years to revise a plan. People say, you know, we have to discuss every little thing over and over to the point where it delays us acting. So there are some diminishing returns there. There are some equity issues where, you know, there is a huge subpopulation of Spanish-speaking folks on the Florida Keys. These meetings are not held in Spanish. And then a lot of people who form the backbone of the service economy, the people who work in hotels, the people who work in the commercial lobster industry, actually have to take a bus 3 hours down from Miami because like a house in the Florida Keys starts at $2 to $3 million. So the people who actually form the backbone of the economy in the Keys, to a large degree, are not included in many of these decisions because of the language barrier, but also just because of the extreme high cost of living in the Florida Keys. And then something that we were very interested in, these experimental policy responses. I want to skip ahead to have you have a look at what we mean when we say experimental policy responses. There are tons of NGOs that are working on coral regrowth, coral replanting, coral nurseries. It's part of what's being compared to a moonshot, and it's now federally managed. It's called the Mission Iconic Reefs Project. And it is the fastest ever, most scaled up, biggest investment ever in this type of regenerative coral growing technology. They're creating gene banks. They're selecting for heat tolerant and disease tolerant corals. In addition to, you know, the heating, the increased storminess that's causing turbidity, so they, you know, the coral organism can't eat as well because the water is cloudier than it used to be. They have a symbiotic photosynthetic algae in the tissue. It can't get the sunlight and make the sugar that it feeds itself with, so they're not doing as well as they used to be. So in addition to the climate, the physical impacts, there was also an unprecedented outbreak of a never-before-seen disease, of course, called stony coral tissue loss. So in addition to gene banking these corals for heat and disease, or for heat tolerance and other impacts of climate change, they're also looking at stony coral tissue loss resistant corals. This is one of those very political things that you can't say yet, but the cause of stony coral tissue loss is most likely the ballast water from cruise ships and from the shipping industry. But you know, people will get very mad at you if you say that. But whenever you're talking to the people who are fighting on, you know, the cutting edge of responding to climate and responding to these diseases, it's the ballast water, is what we're hearing in our interviews. So, you know, when we're looking at adaptive governance to climate change, these are all the things that we want. We want dialogue, we want inclusion, we want these experimental policy responses that aren't kind of stymied by a bureaucracy that won't let anything change or won't let anything happen. What we kind of added to this framework are two things. Accounting for the blockages. So there are many blockages to these types of things happening. First and foremost, there's 5 different agencies that you need a permit from to do coral regeneration, from the Florida Department of Agriculture all the way up to a 5-cycle process with the Marine Sanctuary in the federal sanctuary system anyway. So by the time you're all done getting all your permits for coral growth and coral planting, you've gone through about 12 different cycles of permitting, 5 through the federal system, and then 5 different agencies, plus maybe 2 extra rounds in the state system. So it's a heavy burden, right? And people are trying to kind of change how quickly this happens and make it happen faster. But at the same time, you want your laws in place, right? Like you don't want people out there doing whatever they want, whenever they want. You want there to, so it's like a tension, right? Between like a good regulatory framework where NOAA's in charge and looking after stuff, state folks are in charge and looking after stuff, but you also have room to innovate. So maybe, you know, streamlining the permitting process for coral regrowth in the next 3 years while we're still dealing with like climate impacts and stony coral tissue loss. I'm not sure. But then the other thing that we want in an adaptive governance system is the type of participatory methods that we're kind of piloting through this project. It's very expensive. It takes forever to write stuff up. How can we make it go quicker and cheaper? That's, you know, the next student that comes through. But so this is kind of what we found through our interviews, how people in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary are adapting to change. We just put the peer review edits in, so this should be published pretty soon, and we'll send it around whenever it gets published in the next couple months. So one of the things that we noticed were dive tourism workers were becoming Uber drivers and other sort of temporary careers because the conditions where you have this beautiful clear water, it used to be about a 3-month period. It's now shrunk down to about a month to a month and a half. They're saying it's the windiness, it's the storminess, it's these physical changes that are the result of warming temperatures, but this is like real change on the ground. So when we gave our first scenario with our first picture, almost everybody that we gave that to laughed and said, this happened 10 years ago. Like the future that you're predicting actually happened 10 years ago. And my life has actually changed as a result of this. I'm now an Uber driver in June when I used to be a dive guide. And this is like people of all political stripes, right? You have people with a red hat on telling you this. You have people, working for the federal sanctuary who have a Biden bumper sticker telling you this. It's like all people who work down there telling you this regardless of their political orientation. Now, I had recreational anglers who look for finfish and commercial lobsters saying, by the time you retire, it was some old timers saying, by the time you're my age, this fishery that you grew up with in South Florida will probably operate out of North Carolina. So northward movement to go after lobster and finfish like wahoo. And then restorations. There's some really cool stuff happening with people that are doing restorations, most notably gene banking for these heat-tolerant corals, disease-tolerant corals. Now, can we replant as quickly as we need to kind of like match the outcomes of if we like decarbonized and lowered the temperature? No, but we have to do something in the meantime. We can't just let them die. It's really sad. I remember going out there on like our 4th grade trip to very famous reef, which we used for our case site here, Molasses Reef. And there's a famous grouper that lives there. Everybody loves this grouper. His name is Mo. But I remember very vividly these bright yellow elkhorn corals. And now you can see like the dyed back stubs of these elkhorn. And that was just, 20 years ago, right? So much changes so quickly, but we have to do something. Okay, near the end here. If you want to read more about this, we have it in our new book. We look at how social movements can really prevent kind of like disastrous outcomes in reefs. 3 years ago on the Cayman Islands, the big cruise companies, Carnival, Norwegian, these big cruise companies that many of you have probably cruised with, they're great, it's fun, but they want to build these finger piers out of the most popular ports in Haiti, Jamaica, the Bahamas, and Grand Cayman. And to do this, they need to knock out 10 football fields of coral reefs. And they're saying, hey, it's okay, we can just replant all of the coral that we knock out. And like, if you love diving and you love snorkeling, you know it's not true because it's some of the last remaining pillar corals in all of the Caribbean. I grew up when there was pillar coral. There's no more pillar coral. The fact that they want to just demolish all of this amazing pillar coral and just put these finger piers there. And you may say, the Cayman Islands is rich. Don't they have national level environmental policy? Don't they have international commitments with IUCN? Yes, they do, but these companies, they find a way to kind of erode these serious policy protections in place. And the only thing that prevents this from happening are really great informal social movements. So it was like a group of kids and a group of lawyers who got together and they're like, we're going to sue to prevent this, and we're going to do a protest group called CPR Cayman, and it actually worked. And I worked with them on their court case, and then COVID happened, and election happened, so it's paused for now. But this is happening in all countries in our part of the world that have coral reefs. So watch for it to happen. And it doesn't make the news, right? Like while this was going on, a decision was about to be made, and we tried to get like local celebrity Guy Harvey to come out and say like, no, we don't want this. You're going to smash 10 football fields of coral reefs. Something happened, and he came out on the side of the cruise ship. So there's a lot of money changing hands. There's a lot of, this amazing scientist who used to run some of the labs down at Mote Marine Lab. They plucked him and his NGO that he formed that promises to plant 1 million corals, and they gave him an amazing contract. So he was doing the road show to promise everybody that you can indeed replant a reef. In fact, if you pull out the 10 football fields of coral reef to build these cruise ship piers, we can plant more coral in another part of the island than was there before. It's a complete lie. Like we went to some of the best coral reef scientists in the world, like Terry Hughes in Australia. We were like, can you do this? Can you say so on the BBC? And no, the answer is no, right? But this is just stuff to watch for. We look at why Congress enacts coral reef conservation. Like, why did they fund Mission Iconic Reefs? Why do you have people like Marco Rubio funding these things? Like, what gets in people's heads? Why are reefs special, and how can we use what makes reefs special to get people to care about all climate change and all climate vulnerable ecosystems? So these are some of the other topics that we write about. Our PhD student, Gretchen, she's kind of between her first and second year. She's working on a comprehensive review of all the literature on climate scenario planning when, the NCAR science is matched up with social or economic indicators, what we know, what we don't know. So kind of coming up with a research agenda for the future of this type of research. There are some folks here. We put in an NSF DICES grant. I have a slide for the DICES. Some of us that have worked on the NCAR project, and then some new folks that we've met through our time here at NCAR, kind of doing the same thing, but for mountain ecosystems. I've already kind of started some of this social science research. This is a really interesting place because you have like restocked fisheries, and you have different preferences in different regions of Wyoming and Colorado. Like, if you like to go fishing around Jackson, you know that the trout around there have very unique speckling patterns, and that brings fishermen from all over the world, and it's just a very special type of fish that you can only catch around there. So it's very cool, but some of that stuff is put there intentionally, right? So it's like another layer of abundance, distribution, where the native cutthroat trout are, that sort of stuff. So we'll see if it gets funded, but we're gonna put this project in. So, applying this model to different ecosystems is something that we're interested in doing. Like I mentioned, like I mentioned before, we're working with Wyoming Game and Fish. We're working with the Colorado Parks and Wildlife folks out in Grand County where I live about wolf reintroduction. What do rural people think about this wolf reintroduction? If we care about keeping wolves alive, we have to kind of put these differences aside and see where people can come together. Just like with the climate research, we want to see what motivates people to protect reefs and how we can get, the Marco Rubios of the world, and then, the Barack Obamas of the world, and, bring everybody together to look after these systems and species. Okay, these are the papers that we've managed to put together from the first NCAR grant and the one that we're working on right now. The one that is like fully informed by our NCAR project is right here at the bottom. And like I said before, it's like coming out in the next few months. So if this type of work is interesting to you, and maybe you want to talk about getting a project together like this, I would love to talk to you. Please just send me a message. And I'll take any questions you have, and I really appreciate your time and attention. So thank you.
Okay, do we have any questions in the audience first?
So there's quite a lot of low frequency variability in the North Atlantic. Is that something that people kind of factor in, as well as the climate change?
Pretend like I'm in 6th grade. What is low frequency variability?
Like a decade may be warmer and the next decade may be colder just because of what the ocean is doing.
So I've heard about things like that with like the commercial lobster fishery. Like when I was living up there, one year I remember people being like, oh my goodness, this is more lobster than ever. And then recently it was like lobster desert. I don't know. Is that kind of like an outcome of what you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, how big of a signal that is when it comes to corals compared to long-term warming, and if that's something people consider at all.
So it's an interesting question from the standpoint of bleaching, because bleaching doesn't always kill the coral, right? Like you can just have a bleaching event and you could have 80% of coral recovery, or you can have like 20% of coral recover. So I think like, I don't know what word you guys would use this, but like for this, like the intensity of the variability that you're talking about, I think the reason that coral reefs are so interesting is because they're so sensitive. It's like a 1.8 Fahrenheit difference prolonged has a huge impact on mortality. And then when you have impacts on coral mortality, everything around them, has those impacts too. So we look at these as like interesting policy-making systems because they're so sensitive. So things that aren't quite as sensitive as reefs, a question that we could ask in my world is like, are they easier to govern because they're less sensitive than reefs, or are they just different to govern in different ways? I'm asking a question to answer your question. I think it would be better maybe if Kristen, Fred, Melissa maybe answers the question, so it's like actually useful to people in the room and not just me.
I don't know, they don't really say. I mean, we were talking to the sanctuary managers in Florida Keys. There were definitely worse years and not so worse years. So in terms of variability, for sure, that impacts the corals overall and how much bleaching you see from year to year. But just recently, it was really bad last year. And so maybe it's climate change on top of variability that was just in the wrong combination. But I'm not sure if people are like thinking about like kind of a cyclic variability that might be interesting to them actually.
Maybe for our next project. Like adding a degree of detail as the projects go over time. That's how I'm going to keep, being allowed to work with you guys. I wanted to mention something which I forgot to mention until Kristen started talking. One of the things that we made sure to do in this project, the world of coral reef conservation is a very non-diverse field. So we have very strong links with the Minority in Agriculture, Natural Resource, and Related Science program, MANRS program. So we brought a couple MANRS scholars to the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. Our future grant, if we get the DICES grant with the trout, we're going to bring a group of MANRS scholars out to Yellowstone National Park. But getting young people from traditionally underrepresented groups in marine conservation and fisheries conservation to see themselves in the room here. So that's something I wanted to mention. Kristen did some really great mentorship with our MANRS students who love you, Kristen. I hear it all the time. They're like, when is Kristen coming?
Yeah, go ahead.
I'll try a question. Looking at the national parks here and at the reefs, even the most eco-conscious tourist has an impact. And maybe, the solution is to reduce the number of tourists. And I certainly don't see that in the national parks. They're growing incredibly. How are you going to reduce the number of tourists that visit these places while maintaining some kind of equitability and not making it a playground for the rich alone?
So it's a great question. This is like all of my senior level undergrads who are about to go work for National Park Service in these seasonal summer positions. This is what's causing them to light their hair on fire because they're the ones that actually enforce like the limited use permitting. So Rocky Mountain National Park, if you want to do the Trail Ridge Road, you have to get the limited use permit on May 1st. You have to get the permit, right? Who is the face of telling an entitled, wealthy individual that they cannot come into the park because we're trying to protect some things and we're trying to improve the experience for them, right? It's the 21-year-old fresh graduate who has to do it. So there's so much involved in like, how do we get this model to be the new norm in people's heads? Like you need a permit to come in. We need to do something about these crowds. We need to do something about people trampling the alpine tundra plants. We need to do something about the level of use on the reef up in the more northerly part of the reef where I'm from. It's unbelievable. Like when we have our peak season, it's a type of season called lobster mini season. If you know someone from South Florida, mention lobster mini season to them and they have a wild story for you. Like just people throwing their anchor on the reef, a crazy uncle who goes and cuts someone's line because he doesn't like that they're scraping the anchor across the reef. That's my uncle. Overuse, like almost like cartoonish levels of overuse, right? The Southeast Florida Coral Reef Initiative, where I'm talking about, there's no barrier to entry. You don't even need to get an admission ticket. You just park anywhere along the Tri-County area on the northern part of the reef. So there's no way to actually exclude people from using it, right? So coming up with new and innovative ways. I mean, why do I need a scuba diving license, but not a license to be on the Southeast Florida Coral Reef Initiative where there's listed species, coral disappearing at unprecedented rates. So like creative thinking around these things, normalizing the idea that these types of limited entry permits, it's what we have to do. It's great. Like, people are more wealthy and prosperous than at any point in human history. It means we have more leisure time. It means more people are coming out to the parks. That's awesome. The next step is getting people to accept, you can't yell at the 19-year-old gate guard who it's their first job, right? We need to accept this as like part of the exchange that we make for being able to go out and recreate and enjoy things. Now, to your point, every single time anybody has been diving on a reef, even if you're the best diver in the room, you've done a little nick on the reef with your fin. You have, right? So, what they're doing in the rewriting of the sanctuary management plan is saying, what are the most important crown jewels of this reef system? 500-kilometer reef, what are the most important biologically, from a fishery standpoint, from a tourism standpoint, from an aesthetic viewshed standpoint, what are the most sacred sites? We're gonna basically ban all but a certain type of limited access on this site. As you can imagine, you used to be able to just drive your boat through the entire sanctuary, running a line the whole time for finfish, right? People don't like this, but I think people are getting more used to it over time. Recreational fishermen and commercial fishermen, they have a point whenever they come to these meetings and they say, you divers pretend to be eco-tourists, but you mess up the reef just as much as I do. I don't think that's necessarily true, especially if you've seen these commercial lobster traps just like scraping a whole, reef bank and you're, but I think any little bit helps. I think better research than mine over time will show that any little bit helps too. Like, more finely detailed research will show that these little changes that we're making are helping. Maybe optimistic, I don't know. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. I had a question on the experimental policy approaches, I think you call them, mainly these regrowing initiatives.
Yeah.
I wondered whether for the species selection and combination, you include ecosystem dynamics considerations, and to which degree and how?
So, what would an example of that be? Like a certain type of fish that grazes off that coral, or?
Yeah, for example, or competition among those you try to grow.
That's really interesting. If you've ever looked at the little plugs that they grow coral on, so they're growing the branching coral and then the massive corals, and they grow the massive corals on the plugs. And what the people who are trying to do this very fast and at scale and cheap and try to spread it around, they are having problems with things out competing the growing massive corals on these plugs. I don't know exactly what it is. I think it might be an invasive fire coral that's out competing them. But to answer your question, no. But that is the next step, right? Whenever they figure out just the emergency Band-Aid, this is sort of stuff that a lot of the people who are really running this coral regrowing nursery program got their start in the aquarium industry. So some of the lead people who we've interviewed don't even have a bachelor's degree. They were out there in the 70s pulling bio-rock off the reef and selling it in pet shops. So I think there's a huge, amount of detail that we can add on this to really kind of make it more powerful and more able to scale up. But I think what you're talking about, when they showed me these plugs and they're like, something is out competing my coral, we have to get out there every third day with a toothbrush and scrape it off. Do you know what this is? Do you know how we can stop it? I was like, I have no idea. And I think it was an invasive fire coral, but they're called fire coral because they sting, but also because they spread like fire, right? If you go down to the Aquarius reef base, our underwater reef base, it's covered in fire coral. And when I was a kid, there was, none of it. So to answer your question, that needs to be looked at. I think it would be so awesome. And I think it would really help the people that are kind of doing mission iconic reefs and really at the forefront, but it hasn't happened yet.
Thank you.
All right, we are just on time.
Well, less than karaoke.
My plan was to go down there and check out the reefs when I retire.